Thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to welcome you to this, our second lecture in the series. My name's Jeff McDonald. It's a pleasure to welcome not just the audience here, but the ones that are watching via live streaming and those that are watching the recorded version that sits on our Global Institute webpage. I want to thank, as always, Jay Familietti for providing support within the Institute to put on this series, and most important, John Pomeroy and the Global Water Futures Project for underwriting this series and connecting this to many of the activities going on within Global Water Futures. I want to remind you that next week we have Vitek Krajewski from University of Iowa. He'll be talking about radar rainfall products, so please join us here next Wednesday at the same time for that lecture. But today it's a real thrill and pleasure to welcome Martyn Clark to us today. Martyn's a senior scientist in the Hydrometeorological Applications Program at NCAR. That's the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. Martyn has a stellar background. He hails from, I think, the world's best university, University of Canterbury, my alma mater as well. Interestingly, Martyn and I shared the same graduate advisor, me for PhD, him for master's, I guess, Ian Owens. And then Martyn went to University of Colorado Boulder for his PhD that he completed in 1998. He then transferred to the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at UC Boulder, I guess, and worked there until about 2006 when he went back to New Zealand for 4 or 5 years to work with NIWA. And he was working on a national scale water prediction model, I think, of some sort. You might hear about that today. But since then, he's been at NCAR, and he's now a senior scientist there. Martyn's won many awards and accolades. He is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, which at his tender age is quite a significant accomplishment. And most importantly, many of you will know him in his capacity as editor-in-chief of Water Resources Research. This is a big job. I chaired the search committee, interestingly, that selected Martyn for that job, and Martyn blew the search committee away with his commitment to publishing and innovations in the journal, and I think that's really borne fruit in these last couple of years. He's really taken a great leadership role within that. He's published about 150 papers that focus on his kind of research brand of process-based hydrologic models, sensitivity of water resources to climate change, and streamflow forecasting systems. And you'll hear about some of that today. But the biggest news of all, if you've not heard, is that we've wooed Martyn away from Boulder, Colorado, and he'll be starting here as a professor at the University of Saskatchewan December 1st. So I think we need a round of applause for that before we start off. So, Martyn, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm going to just dive right in and talk about some of the people that I've been working with. I want to highlight a few main collaborators who have been involved in a lot of the work that I'll show today. One of my main partners in crime is this guy here, Bart Nyssen. He's at the University of Washington, so we've worked very closely together over the last several years in a lot of our model development activities. Worked very, very closely with Andy Wood at NCAR, and Andy's one of the world leaders in ensemble streamflow forecasting, and he's really been pushing that field forward in a number of ways over the last several years. I want to highlight Naoki Mizukami, and one of the models that I'll show today is called Mizu route. The reason for that is that Mizu is the Japanese word for water. And he's the lead author of this paper. I want to highlight Andy Newman, who I've been working with on a lot of the ensemble forcing data sets that I'll show, and Nan Zador, who was a postdoc with me for a couple of years and has done a lot of outstanding work in understanding the information content of hydrologic data. So what I want to talk about today is I first want to give some background, and we see that there's been some really remarkable scientific advances and technical advances over the past several decades that are really positioning us to really revolutionize what we can do with process-based hydrological modeling. I'll talk about some of our modeling challenges. I'll talk about modeling, I'll talk about parameter estimation, and I'll talk about generating meteorological forcing data, the input that we have to our models, which can be often a neglected step that we have, especially in mountainous terrain. And then I'll sum up and provide a discussion of research needs towards the end of the presentation. So as background, I want to talk about some advances in remote sensing. GRACE, of course, I mentioned this, given that Jay Familietti is in the house. GRACE has been a wonderful addition to help us to constrain a lot of our large domain hydrological models. CubeSats, the high resolution that we're getting from CubeSats is beginning to revolutionize what we can do. And airborne LiDAR estimates of snow. So this is from a paper published in Water Resources Research by Dennis Ledenmeyer, showing really high spatial resolution estimates of snow water equivalent obtained from the Airborne Snow Observatory that's being led by Tom Painter. So these are some of the new data sets that we have. We've got advances in modeling. I'm going to be talking about some of our advances in hydrological modeling throughout the remainder of the presentation. But one of the exciting things about coming to the University of Saskatchewan is some of the advances in hydrological modelling that are happening here. So this is an animation that Chris Marsh gave me this morning. This is based on work that I think he'd completed last night, using some of his new approaches of triangular grids to simulate snow drifting at really fine spatial resolution. Some of this stuff is really pretty exciting. Information theory, the community's beginning to advance the way that we understand the flow of information through models. It's a more shift from the model evaluation process that's focused on the what questions historically, what's the performance of our models, to address the why questions as to why do our models behave badly and what can we do to improve the model performance. So these temporal information partitioning networks are a way to look at the transfer entropy, look at the relationships between different state variables and fluxes within our models in order to refine our model simulations. Coupled human hydrology interactions, a lot of work going on now to represent humans as an endogenous component of the Earth system, developing simplified differential equations to describe the role of humans. This is an example in terms of the resilience to floods, where floods come through, people can migrate away from the floodplain, get a lot of encroachment to the floodplain during non-floody periods. And a lot of technological advances, of course, high-performance computing, the shift towards open data and open models, and social media. This is a tweet that came recently from the ego hydrologist, where people are beginning to share their contributions to the scientific community. Okay, modeling challenges, process-based modeling. We're interested in the interdisciplinary evolution of land models. What I'm showing in this figure, this is a figure from my colleague Rosie Fisher from NCAR, looking at the evolution of process representations in land models over the last several decades. So when land models were invented or introduced to the community, they were really a lower boundary condition to the atmosphere. The focus was on land atmosphere energy fluxes and limited representation of land processes and feedbacks. As we moved towards the end of last century, there was more focus on mechanistic modeling of land processes. Okay, so this was really under the paradigm of properties-defined processes. So how can we estimate the properties of the landscape, such as vegetation, soil, etc., and use our knowledge of those properties to simulate the short-term fluxes? Now, as we're moving towards today, we're more interested in simulating the dynamics of change, for example, dynamic vegetation, the evolution of vegetation. And this is more shifting us to the paradigm of processes to define properties. So what we used to prescribe in our models, we now simulate, and we're interested in feedbacks and interactions across timescales. When we're looking at a figure here, we can see the evolution of the process representation in land models. And we can see that, as we're getting to today, there's a fairly bewilderingly large array of processes that are included in our models. What I'm not showing here is that we can make a similar diagram in different communities. And when we do this in different communities, we see that the snapshot of where we are today is shared across many different communities, but their trajectory to get to this point has been very, very different. So, for example, in the hydrological community, we included lateral flow much earlier in the evolution of our process-based models. In the hydrological community, we may have included vegetation, much later, where that was one of the first things that were included in these land models. So, when we're putting together a slide like this, it's really emphasizing the fact that we're all trying to solve the same problems, right? And that there's a lot more that we can do to learn from each other and share our experiences in order to advance the evolution of process-based models. So this is our conceptual basis for unifying land models. This is a conceptual diagram of the terrestrial component of the water cycle. It's from NASA. And when we're looking at a diagram like this, we can see that most of us share a common understanding of how the dominant fluxes of water and energy affect the time evolution of states within the system. So we know the states in terms of the storage of snow, storage of water in the soil, etc. And how those state variables evolve through time are dependent on the fluxes. We know what those fluxes are. We've got names for them, etc. And that's where we've got a lot of similarity among our models. Where our models differ is how we discretize the model domain in space, how we parameterize the individual fluxes within our model domain, including the model parameter values, and the methods that we use to solve the governing model equations. So what we did a few years ago is develop the structure for unifying multiple modeling alternatives, which we call SUBA, where we define a single set of conservation equations for land biogeophysics, and then we've got the capability to use different spatial discretizations, different flux parameterizations, different time stepping schemes, etc., so that we can mimic the behavior of multiple models. This is what it looks like. This is what my colleagues refer to affectionately as the hirendogram, which describes the structure of the model. So in the middle, we've got our state variables. So these are the storages of water and energy in our system. So in terms of water, we've got storage of water on the canopy, storage of water in the snow, storage of water in the soil, storage of water in the aquifer, etc. In terms of energy, we've got canopy temperature, snow temperature, soil temperature. These are the states of our system that we evolve through time. And we depart from the ad hoc approach that's used in a lot of models and say, okay, let's separate the physics in our models from the numerics in our models and have a global solver so that we can take advantage of advances in applied mathematics over the past few decades. The evolution of these state variables depends on the fluxes at the boundaries of the control volumes that we have in our system. This is where we have a lot of uncertainty or ambiguity. So we can have fluxes such as vertical redistribution of water, infiltration of water, surface runoff, etc. And there's different parameterizations that we can use to represent those fluxes, and those different parameterizations can have different parameter values. So in this schematic here, we're saying that we're unifying process representations to the extent that we can mix and match different process representations and mimic the behavior of existing models. Okay. We can also look at flexible ways of constructing the landscape. So in terms of the landscape, we can think of a hierarchical spatial organization where we can have hydrological response units nested within grouped response units. And you can have multiple hierarchies, of course, but these hydrological response units and grouped response units can be of any size and shape. So we can have multiple hydrological response units representing hydrologically similar areas of the landscape nested within a river sub-basin. We can have multiple vegetation types nested within a grid cell, etc. The vertical columns map onto these hydrological response units, and we can see that we can begin to mimic the spatial structure of a lot of existing models, such as a last century land model, where we're just representing the vadose zone, where we've got the unsaturated zone over a conceptual aquifer, similar to the variable infiltration capacity model. where we've got multiple unsaturated zones connected to a basin-wide conceptual aquifer similar to the precipitation runoff modelling system, or we can have more of a distributed type configuration where we've got lateral exchanges across multiple columns that we set up within our system. We've been advancing this over the last few years, and we're now to the point where we've got continental-domain simulations and coupled with routing models so that we can begin to address questions over larger spatial scales. There's a number of challenges that we need to address. The first challenge that I wanted to talk about was spatial scaling. Okay. So if we look at a picture like this, we see that a lot of the spatial variability in this landscape occurs across very, very small spatial scales. Right? So we can see the spatial variability in snow drifting, the spatial variability in like hill slope runoff, etc. If we drape a grid over this landscape, a lot of the processes occurring at spatial scales that may be below the grid resolution and would need to be represented implicitly. So this is what people call like hot spots and hot moments. The idea is that we can have small areas of the landscape or short periods of time that can have a disproportionate impact on the large-scale fluxes. This is what we mean when we talk about the scaling problem. So how a large-scale flux is shaped by small-scale variability. Some examples of this are variable source areas, right? So we may get expansion and contraction of saturated areas near the stream. Intermittent turbulence, where the turbulent flux over a time interval such as, half an hour or an hour may be dominated by short bursts of turbulence during that averaging time. Localized rainfall and snowmelt, riparian transpiration, macropore flow, fill and spill, etc. These are all examples as how the large-scale fluxes are shaped by the small-scale heterogeneities. And this is the challenge that we have in process-based modelling. We've got a number of ways of dealing with this. We can have like grid average fluxes. When we're estimating grid average fluxes, and they can be estimated using upscale parameter values. We can have what people call representative parameters that represent like the large-scale manifestation of small-scale processes. New flux parameterizations, where we can have different equations that are used at different spatial scales. Subgrid probability distributions, where we can have a probability distribution that represents the subgrid spatial variability in a state variable that we're interested in, such as like soil moisture, depth to the water table, etc. Different methods to do this, and then different methods for spatial discretization, where we can say, okay, instead of draping a grid over the landscape, let's recognize that different areas of the landscape behave similarly and they can be lumped together. Let's say that we're interested in flow over the dimension of a hill slope, but we don't want to represent all hill slopes independently, so we may have a representative hill slope and represent flow across that representative hill slope. We may have separate computations for process subsets. An example of this in eco-hydrology is that we have separate computations for sunlit and shaded leaves so that we can have adequate scaling from the leaf scale to the canopy scale. At larger spatial scales, we may have separate scaling, separate computations over snow-covered terrain and snow-free terrain, so we're getting a better estimate of the area average energy fluxes, etc. And you can think as the ways that this could be done across multiple models. Another challenge that we have is understanding complexity. We often think of complexity in terms of two axes. One's process complexity, so the question there is what processes are represented explicitly, and the other spatial complexity, and there we're interested in to what extent do we discretize the landscape and represent the flow of water across model elements. So often, people, when they're developing models, don't think of complexity as a continuum in this way. They've got their model and they organize themselves into a specific modeling camp where we're a lumped modeling camp where we don't necessarily represent the spatial complexity and all of the spatial variability is lumped into a single computational unit. Or that we're the process-based camp, where we're trying to explicitly simulate all of the dominant processes that we think are important, etc. So when we're doing that, we can see the traditional distinctions that we have in hydrology, where people may subscribe to bucket-style rainfall runoff modelling skill, where we might have lumping of processes, lumping of the landscape, versus the process-based hydrological modelling skill, where we explicitly represent the dominant hydrologic and biophysical processes, explicitly represent details of the landscape, and the implications of that for the way that we do model analysis. So in bucket-style models, there's a lot of reliance on inverse methods to estimate model parameters, with the idea, if we pull a quote from Jim Kirchner's 2006 Water Resources research paper, is that models are mathematical marionettes that dance to match the calibration data, even if their underlying premises are incorrect, can be theoretically unsatisfying. Or where we may rely on geophysical data to estimate model parameters and have widespread use of spatially constant parameters obtained from limited experimental data. There's challenges associated to that I'll return to later. The bucket-style models are computationally frugal, which enables use of ensemble methods, enables experimentation with different model parameters. The process-based models are more computationally expensive, and if we push them to the limit, it can mean that we're often restricted to a single deterministic simulation, and there's limited opportunities for model analysis and model refinement. So where we're going with this is that we want to move away from this dichotomous worldview of modelling and begin to explicitly evaluate trade-offs that we have in process complexity and spatial complexity. Some possible solutions that I mentioned earlier were the ideas of hydrological similarity, representative hill slopes, etc. And when we're pushing this forward, we're seeing that application of these ideas can lead to model simulations that have got the same information content but run orders of magnitude faster. Nate Cheney has been doing a lot of recent research on this with Eric Wood at Princeton, and this is really beginning to become quite a useful solution. In our work, we're doing a lot of work across multiple catchments. This is work primarily from Nansador, where we've put together 600-odd testbed catchments across the contiguous United States, and we've implemented multiple models across those large sample of catchments, a lot of existing models such as VIC, Community Land Model, NOAA-MP, PRMS, HPV, MHMSAC, etc. And then we've also been implementing our multiple hypothesis frameworks, FUSE and SUMA, so that we can begin to understand why models perform well in different environments. This figure here is the cumulative probability distribution of the Nash-Sutcliffe score from an ensemble of different models that we've implemented across this diverse range of catchments. Okay, parameter estimation. Often, when we're running these models, we need to estimate fixed parameters that we have in the model equations. These fixed parameters are typically not very well known, and a lot of the data sets that we have don't have sufficient resolution information content to provide information on the model, on the parameters that are important in our models. An example is soil parameters such as hydraulic conductivity, which is describing the transmission of water through soil. Right? And we may have the same soil map over a large geographical domain, and the information content in that soil map may not be sufficient to describe the parameter that's important in a model. Also, and I'll return to this in a second, is that the rigid structure of complex models, where there's an approach where we may treat uncertain parameters as physical constants, can constrain our capabilities to represent the spatial variations in hydrological processes that are important. This is a paper that we published a couple of years ago where we're asking the question if we're unnecessarily constraining the agility of complex process-based models. So there are many modelers in the room. Yeah, a few. So if we look at some source code, if we geek out just a little bit, this is some source code from a mystery model. This equation here is showing the time evolution of snow albedo. This hard-coded parameter here, 0.01, is describing the rate of decay of snow albedo. And this is, in this model, it's really represented as a physical constant because this number here is fixed and it can't be adjusted. Okay. We know in nature that the change in snow albedo with time, can be quite heterogeneous spatially, and can vary through time. And our model may represent our idealistic representations of reality, but it may not really represent, what's happening in nature. So we see this type of practice happening throughout a lot of process-based models, which mean that they don't have the agility that they need to simulate the processes that are important in different landscapes across the world. And another challenge that we have is estimating parameters over larger geographical domains. Here I'm showing spatial fields of model parameters. This is in the variable infiltration capacity model. These spatial fields of model parameters were obtained by compiling model calibrations that were done by different graduate students over a 20-year period. Right, so you can almost identify the graduate student who was responsible for the parameters in different parts of the spatial domain. This has got large spatial variability in the model parameters, which is translating to large spatial variability in simulations of surface flow and base flow, and providing results that are somewhat unsatisfactory. These simulations were actually used in a water security report to the US Congress. Our approach, the problem with continental domain parameter estimation is that the dimensionality of the problem is quite large, so we need some way to regularize the problem. Our approach is to pull from some work done by Luis Samaniego at University of Leipzig and Helmholtz Institute in Germany. And here the approach is to say, okay, we've got information on geophysical attributes, and we've got transfer functions that translate our geophysical attributes to model parameters. Let's modify the coefficient in those transfer functions rather than the model parameters themselves to get continental domain parameter estimates. So that's what we've been doing. We've been following this approach, and we're removing the spatial discontinuities and getting reasonable representations of surface runoff. Reasonable spatial variability and surface runoff and base flow. So we've removed the spatial discontinuities. There's still a lot of work that we're still engaged with to use this approach to improve the fidelity of the model simulations. We've also been returning to our collection of catchments across the contiguous United States. This is work from Nan Zador, and we've had one model, the Sacramento model, that's been set up and calibrated for all of these catchments. And we've also got a statistical model which is trying to predict the hydrological behaviour based on catchment attributes. This is a random forest model, and here we've got the observations. So this is an example where we've got the observations of mean annual flow, the predictions of mean annual flow from our statistical model, and predictions of mean annual flow from our time-stepping simulation model. And they're all, quite similar and, quite good. If we go to another hydrological signature, this signature here is the slope of the flow duration curve. So the red colours here are where we've got more of a damped response, and the blue colours are where we've got more of a variable regime. And here we're seeing we've got a lot of spatial heterogeneity in the slope of the flow duration curve. Some of that's represented by the random forest, some of that's represented by the Sacramento model, but the skill is not too large. So we're using this as a way to try and understand the information content that we have and the different data sets to provide insight to how we can estimate our model parameters. So the first thing that Nans did is he was saying, okay, now random forest, we've got 22 catchment attributes that we're using as predictors, and then we've got 17 hydrological signatures as response variables, right? So I gave you examples of like 2 hydrological signatures. One was mean flow, one was the slope of the flow duration curve. And then he's asking the question, well, to what extent do different classes of predictors have explanatory power for the hydrological signatures that we're interested in? So we've got some explanatory power from topography, some explanatory power from climate, limited explanatory power from soil, and limited explanatory power from vegetation. So here we're seeing the information that we have in soils is in this statistical model is not that useful to predict the signatures of hydrological behavior. The next thing that we did is we evaluated the fit and that we're getting from the random forest, which is the statistical model, and Sacramento, which is the time-stepping simulation model. And we're seeing that both models, both the physical and the statistical models, have similar difficulty in simulating some of the hydrological signatures. The third thing that we looked at was an index of the spatial variability, Moran's I, which is here, and this is the index of the spatial variability here. So the difficulty in simulating the signatures related to the spatial noise that we had in the hydrological signature. So this is helping us understand how we can calibrate models, how we can evaluate models, how we can select models, etc. Because we might not necessarily want to rely on some of the hydrological signatures that are difficult to predict. We may not want to spend all of our time to try and define a transfer function that relates soil parameters to some signature if there's no information content there, etc. It's providing a means to guide our model evaluation and development strategies. So this is really where we are in terms of inference approaches for parameter estimation. We've got attributes, which I talked about at the beginning. These are our geophysical attributes, such as elevation, slope, soil type, etc., that we may have and use those to estimate our model parameters. That's through regionalization approaches. We can relate our attributes to hydrological signatures, indices describing hydrological behavior. So this is the information content that I just described. And then we can do some sensitivity analyses that I haven't described, where we can perturb our model parameters and evaluate the extent to which our signatures respond to those parameter perturbations. And we can slice and dice the problem in different ways and turn ourselves inside out and try and make some progress here. And there's a lot of constraints. But where I think we should be going is to say, well, okay, this is often a statistical approach to the parameter estimation problem. Can we begin to turn this around and have more of a physical approach to the parameter estimation problem? And that's where we need to study process interactions across timescales. So often, what we're treating as parameters in our model, say leaf area index as an example, are things that we can also simulate. So can we move away from the paradigm that we're largely adopting in hydrology, to try and specify the properties of the landscape and then use our knowledge of the landscape properties to simulate processes, and turn that around and say, well, okay, can we do a better job of simulating the long-term evolution of our landscapes, the evolution of vegetation, the evolution of soils, etc., and where processes define properties, and use that to provide a more reasonable representation of Earth system change. An example that I've got at the bottom here is, how does landscape evolution define the storage and transmission properties of the landscape? Are there some things that we can begin to pull into our models from geomorphological theory that can give us a better idea of how hydrological processes vary across space? This is already beginning to be done in the Earth system modeling community, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from that community to improve how we're treating the parameter estimation problem in hydrology. Okay. Wanted to talk a little bit about our meteorological forcing data. So often when we're running our models, we may have input from climate stations. This is an example of, say, like 10,000 climate stations or 12,000 climate stations across the contiguous United States and southern Canada. And often what we might do is interpolate these climate stations to a grid, and then use the interpolations on a grid to force a land model to simulate land hydrology. Right? That's fine, but often when we do that, we smooth the station data. The station data can be overly smooth, and we don't represent the uncertainty that we have in our gridded forcing fields. So what we did a few years ago was a method to generate probabilistic forcing data, so ensemble forcing data, where we're using the station data to estimate the probability distribution of each grid cell. And then we synthesize ensemble members by constructing spatially correlated random fields to generate ensemble maps of precipitation instead of deterministic maps of precipitation. And here's an example here of 3 ensemble members that we view as equally plausible representations of the precipitation that occurred on this day. Right, and in doing this allows us to run our model multiple times from all of our ensemble members and represent the impact of forcing uncertainty that we have on our model simulations. We've extended this to the contiguous United States and developed a data set that's actually extended to the present now. What I'm showing here is example output for a couple of ensemble members in June of 1993. Here's ensemble member 11, ensemble member 75, etc. This is the ensemble mean precipitation, which we might get from a deterministic data set. But the nice thing that we get here is an estimate of the uncertainty in the data set. In this example here, there were floods in the Mississippi in June 1993. We've got less uncertainty in the northern part of the domain, and more uncertainty in the southern part of the domain where precipitation was more convective in nature. A lot of applications here. This is an example to evaluate numerical weather prediction model output. So here this is work from Andreas Prine, where he hatched out areas where the numerical weather prediction model was within the ensemble, and he focused on areas where it was outside of the ensemble to identify conditional bias in the numerical weather prediction model, so that his strategies for model advancement weren't contaminated by uncertainty that we had in the model observations. We also use this for a lot of data assimilation applications. Here's an example where we've got ensemble simulations of snow water equivalent up to the end of the season, where we have observations. This is used to estimate the uncertainty that we have in snow water equivalent. We assimilate the observations and refine our simulations of snow melt during the melt season. We've also got some approaches where we're using particle filters in this ensemble framework to refine our simulations of streamflow in different basins across the country. But as we're moving forward, we're interested in new meteorological forcing data products. This is just an example of simulations of the hydrology that we could do over North America using data sets that are available globally. On the left is simulations of snow. On the right are simulations of streamflow. As we're moving forward, it would be great to take some of the methods that we've developed in the contiguous United States, combine those with some of the methods that are developed in Canada, and develop a high-resolution North American probabilistic forcing data set that fuses rain gauges, radar, satellite, numerical weather prediction, etc. That would have to be restricted to the period 1980 to present because of the data availability, or we could have a gauge-only data set that could extend like more than a century or more. And that would be super helpful, to refine a lot of the simulations that we're trying to do over larger continental domains. Okay, so I want to sum up and talk about some research needs as we move towards the end. First, provide some opinions. So I talked about our SUMA framework, and I talked a little bit about information theory, and I think as we're moving forward, we need better frameworks to evaluate the merit of subjective decisions that we make during model development. So that can be multiple hypothesis frameworks, explicitly evaluating the information flow through models, etc. There's a lot that we can do there, a lot of model evaluation and research catchments that will really help us move forward. We need to treat parameter estimation as a model development problem. Often parameter estimation is treated as a statistical exercise, and it doesn't have as much physical insight as I think is necessary. In terms of processes, I think the biggest challenge that we have is the scaling problem, and how we address the impact of small-scale heterogeneities on large-scale fluxes. So there's a number of methods that we already have in our quiver, a number of arrows that we already have in our quiver to do that. Mix of explicit discretization and implicit parameterizations to improve our estimate of large-scale fluxes. Parameters. We need to incorporate stronger hydrological theory when evaluating model parameters. Effectively, what parameters are describing, in many cases, for soil hydrology parameters, they're describing the storage and transmission of water across the landscape, right? So that's something that's deeply rooted in nature, something that we should be doing a better job of observing and a better job of inferring based on our model simulations. Process parameters, parameterizations, and model parameters are highly interrelated and should be considered together. Computing. We shouldn't let the allure of computing advances constrain our capabilities for model analysis. What I often see is that we're trying to push our models to the limit to the extent that we can only afford a single deterministic simulation, and that doesn't provide us with the opportunities that we need to really evaluate our model and to refine our model. In terms of the modeling strategy, what I'm advocating for is to focus on processes, so we need to isolate and evaluate competing modeling approaches. And parameters, we need to improve the agility of process-based models and focus squarely on relating geophysical attributes to model parameters. So we can't have the strong constraints that often exist in these models. We need to be honest about what we don't know and explicitly try to refine our models. And computing, there's a lot that we can do to reduce the computational expense of process-based models without sacrificing our representation of processes, and I think we need to spend more attention on that moving forward. We need to explicitly characterize model uncertainty. I gave the example of probabilistic quantitative precipitation estimation. There's a lot more that we can do. Ensembles of alternative model configurations, that could be configured through the SUMA framework, etc. But our overall goal is to improve the physical realism of models at any scale through better informed choices about the physics. So I'll stop there, and thank everybody.
All right, thank you very much, Martyn. We have time for questions, and we have a microphone that I can either pass or you can maybe step up to the mic if you have a question just because we are recording, we'd like others to hear the questions. Yeah, John. And I'll bring you the mic.
Yeah. Martyn, the question that modelers always have is how complex to make the model.
Yeah.
And we're not constrained much by computers anymore, but we are constrained by our brains and what we know. And so how do you balance that? I mean, you've outlined this, but when you get down to a practical situation, you've got a situation of Canada, which you're coming to. We know a fair bit about the south and not much about the north. So how do we address that with complexity, and what would be the key factors in your thinking that we need to address as we develop those models?
I'm not sure if I understand the question completely.
Okay. We can design at this point models of varying levels of complexity,
Right.
For various purposes.
Okay.
What would be the constraints and the considerations that you would make doing that across a country like Canada, where there's often a lot of uncertainty on inputs, measurements, parameters, even the shape of drainage basins?
Right. So another way of asking that question is what complexity of your model is justified given the uncertainty that we have in the data?
Yes.
Or another way of asking that question is, are there processes that we don't know about yet that we really should be exploring to include in the model?
Yes.
Right. So the first one, and I think the framework that I described gets at this, is that we spend more time evaluating the model trade-offs. So from what we've seen at the moment is that a lot of people form themselves into modelling camps, like rightly or wrongly, and their preference for a specific modelling approach is based on their education and experience. And there's debates over, whether class A of models is better than class B of models, but people have really organised themselves into different schools of thought. What I haven't seen happening yet, which I think is super important, is to explicitly evaluate the trade-offs that we have when we gradually increase in complexity in terms of processes and gradually increase complexity in terms of our representation of the spatial variability. That's critically important, but that has to be done in an information theory framework, I think. So that links back to your question as to is the data available to support it? So if you're doing it in a formal framework, it allows you to ask the questions about information transfer across scales and really evaluate the benefits that you're getting by more explicitly representing specific processes or more explicitly representing the details of the landscape.
Good.
That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is that we need more field work, right? In terms of what don't we understand, right? Is that we have to go out and measure it, and we have to do a lot more in confronting our models with experimental data and a lot of the research basins where the models haven't historically been evaluated.
Yeah, we have the Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns still out there.
Yep.
Make it exciting. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, more field work. That's music to my ears. I agree completely. And it's just so sad that all hydrologists couldn't be trained at the University of Canterbury, isn't it? I mean,
it is sad.
The world would be such a better place if everyone could go to New Zealand and study. We have people watching on the simulcast, and we have a question online here by Palash Sanyal, and he's referring to some of the things you were saying about various indicators. He's wondering, what are the challenges you find obtaining landscape data, and how can data from models be used to inform, I guess, other models? And he's wondering generally about what variables you think we should focus on, but we're not focusing on currently in present models, if that makes sense. And you can ponder that. We can talk about that over beer, and I can email him later.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what he's interested in that question. Our approach has been large sample hydrology, right? Is that what we're seeing is historically a lot of model evaluation has been done in a small set of catchments, and the work that I showed from Nan Zador was to pull a large set of catchments together and extract multiple data sets from all of those catchments so that we could provide insights into different parts of the model. I think that's the path forward.
Right.
That's just part of the problem. The other part of the problem is having the modelling tools, the modular modelling approaches that give us the capability to isolate specific components of our model in a more deliberate way.
Yes.
So that combined with incisive process diagnostics, I think is a major path forward.
Good, good. Other questions? I can pass the mic, Andrew.
So when it comes to modelling, I was always taught that it's horses for courses, and you develop a model to address one specific question. You seem to be suggesting, perhaps this isn't fair, but you seem to be suggesting that you're going towards a unified model, and perhaps that's a model that does everything. Is that realistically what you're saying, or if not, what is the problem that these continental scale models is actually trying to address?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's kind of two aspects to that problem. I'll answer the first question first, which is like, are we interested in a model that does everything? And I would say yes to a point, right? Can we have, a model that does everything and contrast that against a model that's like tailored for a specific purpose, and be able to say that the model that does everything is going to be better than the purpose-specific model for that purpose? And the answer to that is no. But then if we turn that question around and say, well, can we adopt more of a community-oriented approach to modelling, and begin to put things together in a more meaningful and deliberate way? Are there opportunities to learn from each other and reduce the duplication of effort? And then I think the answer to that question is yes. And then that leads us with a conundrum, which is, well, okay, so what's the path forward? Because we want model A that's best, for purpose B. And there, I think the path forward is to depart a little bit away from the paradigm of community models and more towards the paradigm of community modelling. And that seems like a subtle distinction, but what I mean by that is, can we do a better job of sharing code and concepts across different model development groups, right? So we might be not necessarily be contributing to the same community model, but as a community, we've organised ourselves in a way so that when we're developing new ideas, those new ideas can be more easily plugged in to multiple community hydrological models, right? And then I think that's going to be the path forward. And that brings us back to coding standards, data standards, like interfaces, etc. It becomes more of a computational science challenge, but I think it's a challenge that really needs to be addressed so that we can learn from each other more effectively.
Okay, thank you.
Martyn, thanks so much. I don't know if it's check. Martyn, thanks so much for your talk. Really, it's working now. Really fantastic.
Right.
It's kind of very philosophical about the essence of modeling and what are we doing. And you mentioned that some of the different camps, maybe outside of hydrology, have incorporated different components into the modeling process before hydrologists did. And I wonder if you could...
And vice versa.
Or vice versa, yeah. And I wonder if you could mention how maybe different groups outside of hydrology incorporated people into the modeling, and to what extent they had people help evaluate the usefulness of those modeling tools for decision makers, say outside of hydrology.
So, to what extent was this done by people reading papers in another discipline and incorporating those concepts in their own models, or to what extent was it done through collaboration? Is that the question? It's model dependent, right? It's always a little bit of both. Modeling groups are always limited by their expertise and their capacity for collaboration, and often simplistic approaches are implemented where they're needed in order to move forward. from a bigger perspective, of course, the collaboration is what's needed to really drive things, but collaboration takes resources, and the reality is that we're in a resource-constrained environment, and we can't always collaborate to the extent that we need to.
As a hill slope hydrologist, sorry, Irina, going to AGU for the last 30 years, I always felt like, what is my place in the world? Because there's no hill slope hydrology in a global land surface model. And I know there's a paper coming out in your big AGU Centennial WR issue, right, led by Yin-Fan Reinfelder, that's trying to think about what do we need to represent in terms of hill slope hydrology in a global climate model, I guess. And wow, that's such a big thing for us lowly hill slope hydrologists to feel like we're part of things finally. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to also say how much I appreciated your talk, but to extend some of the comments that Graham made. I've been working in Canadian hydrology my entire career, and sometimes feel like I'm living in a developing country because just how weak our long-term records are, especially with experimental catchments, and the envy is to look at the US. And so we have to be imaginative here, and some of the, especially in the north, we're starting to look to oral histories of indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. And my question is, how comfortable are you with that? Have you done it before? And what do you think is the merit of having some of these oral histories incorporated within the process of developing the model and or validating those model outputs?
I have no experience in that. But what I would say is, when you're talking about oral histories of Indigenous people, there's some similarities to the evolution of people's perceptual understanding of how catchments work, right? And I think that's what we're missing in terms of model development, is linking our models to the emerging hydrological theory. So if you theory as our explanations of processes, right? And those explanations can come from multiple different people, from diverse backgrounds. When we're involved in model development, often the conversations are starting with differences among algorithms, and the link with theory has been severed. Right, and what I'd really like to see is that, some of the work that, Jeff, you've done in MyMy, I'm thinking of Brian McGlynn's paper in particular in terms of the evolving perceptual model in the MyMy catchment, right? That's good, but it's not bringing us up to the level where we need to be in terms of our evolving perceptual model of the world. Right, mm-hmm. And so how can we have process explanations that are general, so we can understand the generality of hydrological process descriptions, marry that with our models, understand where idiosyncrasies are perhaps idiosyncrasies, and begin to strengthen the link that we have between our evolving theory and what's in our models. And that's a huge challenge. And I know that's something that Jeff's been working on, the project that Jeff mentioned, that Yin-Fan Reinfelder is working on, synthesizing process understanding from the critical zone observatories community. Those are all important things, but I think we need to do a lot more of it, a lot more synthesis.
Martyn, we want to thank you for a really stimulating talk and a great Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.